everyone, welcome back to Let's Resin. Today, we're going to show you how to polish or smooth edges without a large polish machine. Well, the resin mold we just made often has such sharp edges, or some excess spilled resin, which will affect the beauty of the piece, so we need to smooth it out. Like this mold, it's always a trouble with the borders because there are more spills and sharp edges, so we usually sand them off after we finish the piece to make it more rounded. During the process of making this table, this excess resin tends to appear on the edges. We need to polish the edges to prevent our hands from being scratched when using the table. As you can see when we are making the table, sometimes some resin will spill out and the edges will be sharp. So we're going to remove this part and sand it smooth, which will be safer to use. Next, we will introduce the tools we use for polishing. If we want to make the project more beautiful, then these auxiliary tools are necessary. One is our file. The grinding surface of the file is metal, which is wear resistant and rough. Therefore, it is more suitable for the first step. It can smooth away the large spilled resin. After polishing, we can use sanding paper to smooth it later, which will be easier. As the file will have a stronger sharpening power and it comes in different shapes for different situations, even these corners can be polished. Next is sandpaper, which comes in a number of different grits, from low to high, 320, 600, 1000, 1500, 3000, and 5000. The lower the grit, the higher the friction. Basically, 6 levels of mesh are enough to sand our resin to a smooth finish. After we finish sanding the piece with sandpaper, the next step is to use sanding blocks. It's like a sponge, a relatively small piece of sandpaper that has only a slight sanding power on the surface. After polishing with it, our piece will be smooth, and the last step is to apply a coat of polishing wax so that our piece will be shiny. Polishing wax should be used in conjunction with a polishing cloth, which will allow the wax to fill the surface of our drops more evenly and make the piece shine. Most importantly, the sanding process will definitely produce a lot of dust and debris. So water is important. It can prevent the dust and debris from flying and also wash away the debris that we sanded, which speeds up the sanding process. Now that all tools have been introduced, it's time to move on to the formal sanding stage. We select this part and get out the file for sanding. Why use a file in the first place? As we mentioned before, a file is rougher than sandpaper, which will help a lot at the first sanding stage and save time for the next step. Then, sand the rough areas first. It's best to sand evenly in one direction so that the original shape of the piece is maintained. Remember to spray water to moisten it when polishing. This will prevent dust and a lot of debris from affecting our polish. Since there was a raised area here, we had to sandpaper it off. First, spray water in this direction and then sand away the excess protrusion. Please note that you must keep spraying water while sanding the debris. After spraying the water, then continue sanding. This process requires more patience. Not only in terms of where to sand, but also in terms of using a lot of different grits of sandpaper, so be prepared. The purpose of polishing is not only to make the piece look more beautiful, but also to make it safer to use. If the edges are sharp or not smooth, they can easily cut our hands. So remember, don't leave any edge untouched. In this way, every part of our piece will be polished and the whole piece will be polished smoothly and beautifully. Although the process takes a long time and is tedious, it can be a stress reliever. Sanding to the point where it looks rough but is almost round to the touch, as we did, is basically sufficient. We also have to smooth the file. We don't need to make it shiny, but we do need to round off this tip so that it's very smooth and curved to the touch, not sharp like this. Come on, let's take a look. Just file it down to this level. It's not sharp, it's a little curved. When it's all sharpened, it'll be shiny and not scratchy. We'll start with the roughest piece of sanding paper and work our way up to the finest until we've sanded the piece all the way through. Now let's start using sandpaper. We can cut the sandpaper, which makes it easier to hold and there's no waste. Pinch the sandpaper between the thumb and middle finger, and place the index finger in the middle of it. In this way, we have better control of the force and there is no slippage. Polish it again where we just used the file to polish. We can spray with water if there is dust during the sanding process. And follow the direction that we just used the file to grind in. It doesn't take long to sand with sandpaper, because we have used a file to grind off most of the sharp edges. So sanding with sandpaper is to make it more detailed. Please pay attention to sanding evenly and do not leave any edges. After the first pass of sanding, its surface will be finer than where it was polished with a file. But we can still clearly see the scratches, which are different from the clarity on both sides. So next we need to use finer sandpaper to sand it. Take a 600 grit sandpaper and cut it to size. Then put the remaining sandpaper away. Hold the sandpaper with the same motion and continue to sand it. We can spray some water during the process. The finer the sandpaper, the better the sanding effect and the smoother the rough surface will be. When you feel that the sandpaper is not working well, then you can change the position of it. After polishing this time, the effect is better than last time. Next we used 1000 grit sandpaper for sanding, and it worked even better this time. Then we'll switch to 1500 grit sandpaper and success is close at hand. Let's take a look at the result after sanding with 1500 grit sandpaper. Basically, we can see that the surface is very smooth. And the curvature is very beautiful without any sharp edges. It is a gradual transition to this side. Well, it's the same on this side. Next we take out our 3600 grit sandpaper and pinch it. This sandpaper doesn't have a very coarse grain anymore, but it still has a bit of a sanding effect. At this time, we can slowly polish outwards a little more, because there will be some friction here during the previous sanding process. This sandpaper is relatively fine, so we can use it to polish. Now let's take a look at the middle edge, which is almost as translucent as both sides. But it's still a bit rough. Look at this. It's our last 5000 grit sandpaper. After polishing with this sandpaper, we can use the polishing block. Compared to the previous sandpaper, this one no longer has much friction. And we can see that it will be more translucent after polishing. Let's take a look at the edges, which are already very translucent and rounded. So, the steps for sanding with different grits of sandpaper have all been completed. We used 6 pieces of sandpaper with different grits to polish our craft to this effect. Remember what it looked like before? Let's have a look at the before and after comparison. Then take out our polishing block, which has rough and fine sides. Now we just need finer side. This is the final polishing of our craft. The polishing block can be used over large areas because it has very little friction. Even if you rub it into a smooth area, it won't hurt it. This is the effect after using the polishing block. Finally, we need to use polishing wax to give it a layer of wax. Dip a little wax into the polishing cloth and apply it evenly on the polished craft. It's not only smooth but also translucent. Then, apply the wax on the remaining area. Let's appreciate the finished craft. The sharp edges have turned into smoothly transitioning arc edges. And polish this sphere in the same way. Use a file to sand off excess resin and pitted areas. We can see that there are many small bubbles attached to the surface of the craft, which can also be removed by polishing. At this time we can spray some water. It's the same principle as sanding the previous tiny house craft. Just use a file to sand off the larger areas of excess resin. After grinding for a while, the gaps in the file will be filled with debris and it will not be sharp. At this point, you can rinse the file with water to remove any debris from the crevices, which will make it better for polishing. Polishing the sphere to this state basically removes all the excess resin. And the unevenness on the side of the sphere also needs to be sanded. Basically, most of the areas need to be sanded until there is no unevenness. The surface of some crafts will have some air bubbles during the production process. So we can get rid of these bubbles by sanding. Next, let's use sandpaper to polish the surface of the sphere. But the spheres are sanded differently than squares. We can hold the sphere and rub it directly on the sandpaper, which will be faster and less laborious. And pay attention to grinding every place and changing the angle of the sphere. During the polishing process, we can spray some water on the sandpaper to increase its friction. Polish it until all air bubbles disappear. Now switch to 600 grit sandpaper and continue polishing. If there are still some sanding marks, we can use a larger grit sandpaper to continue sanding. Let's switch to 1000 grit sandpaper. Finally, apply a coat of wax to the sphere with a polishing cloth. Due to the relatively large size of the tabletop, it basically just sits there to be polished. We need to sand it until it is smooth. The next step is to sand the edges of the table with varying grit sandpaper. 600 grits, 1000 grits, 1500 grits, 3000 grits, and last 5000 grits. Here we go again with the polishing block. Use it to polish the table evenly and quickly. Then apply polishing wax when finished polishing, which is the icing on the cake. We just polished part of the tabletop, and the contrast is very obvious. Let's appreciate the final polishing effect. It is very safe to touch and will not scratch your hands. These are the 3 ways to sand resin crafts of different shapes and sizes. Hope it can help you. Glad to share it with you and look forward to sharing next time. If you liked it, please click the thumb up button and subscribe for more fun resin craft ideas. Also leave a comment if you'd like to learn something in the next video. That would be awesome.